Nobody was laughing the morning Willa Garnett wired 4 weatherproof horn speakers into the rafters of her hog barn. But they were laughing by afternoon, and the laughter would travel through Dallas County, Iowa, the way all laughter travels through a farming community. From the barn, to the truck cab, to the grain elevator counter, to the corner table at the Main Street Cafe, picking up detail and losing accuracy at every stop, until it arrived at its final form, which was the version that made the most sense to people who had already decided what they were looking at. What they were looking at, or thought they were looking at, was a 43-year-old widow in over her head. 3 men were standing at the fence that morning in October of 1982. They had driven past on County Road F31 and had seen Willa's truck pulled up close to the side door of the finishing barn, and had slowed down the way men slow down when they see something they cannot immediately categorize. They had gotten out. They had walked to the fence. They had watched her move in and out of the barn door carrying commercial audio equipment in cardboard boxes, the kind of equipment you saw in school gymnasiums and church fellowship halls, not in hog operations in central Iowa. They stood at the fence with their hands in their jacket pockets and their hats pulled down against the October cold, and they watched in the way a man watches something he believes he understands, but cannot quite explain. Half curious, half embarrassed on her behalf, absolutely certain that what they were seeing was a mistake of some kind, that the grief of the previous 6 months had tilted something in her reasoning that a few more months and some practical advice from someone with experience might set right. Clem Garnett had died on a Monday morning in April of 1982. He was 46 years old. He had gotten up before 5, the same as always, eaten the breakfast Willa had made him. The same as always, and walked out to the loading barn to move a trailer of finished hogs for the slaughterhouse run to Des Moines. The load was scheduled for 7. Willa found him in the loading chute at 11:30 when he did not come in for lunch. The coroner said it had been fast, a heart attack. Clem had likely been gone within 2 or 3 minutes of the first symptom. Willa had thanked the coroner. She had gone home and sat at the kitchen table for an hour without moving. Then she had gone back out to the loading barn and finished moving the hogs because the truck was coming. And the hogs needed to go, and somewhere underneath everything she was feeling in that hour at the kitchen table, Willa Garnett understood with the particular clarity that practical people find in impossible moments that 800 hogs do not stop needing feed and water and care, because the man who built the operation for them died in the loading chute on a Monday morning in April. The funeral was on Thursday. On Friday morning, Willa was back in the barn doing chores. The neighbors noticed. The men of Dallas County were kind to her in the way that rural Midwestern men are kind to new widows, which is to say they were genuinely decent about it, and also could not entirely conceal the assumption that was running underneath the decency. They brought food. They offered help with the heavy work. They asked her more than once, gently and carefully, whether she had thought about what she was going to do with the place. The assumption underneath those questions was not hidden. Not really. A widow did not run a hog operation in central Iowa in 1982. A widow sold the equipment, rented out the ground, and moved into something smaller and more manageable in town. Everyone who asked Willa about her plans was in their own way trying to help her follow that expected path. They meant well. Every one of them meant well. Willa listened to all of it. She thanked every person who brought a casserole or asked about her plans. She said she had not made any decisions yet, and she kept raising hogs. By September of 1982, 5 months after Clem had died, the Ross farm was still running. Not as smoothly as it had run when Clem was alive, because nothing runs as smoothly without the person who built it and understood every part of it. Willa had hired a high school boy from Perry named Tommy Vouse to help 3 afternoons a week. Between the 2 of them and a great deal of quiet stubbornness on Willa's part, the hogs got raised. What Willa noticed in those first months alone was that the hogs were not right, not sick, not injured in any visible way, not underfed, but nervous in a way she had not seen before, or perhaps had seen before and had not had reason to look at closely, because Clem had always been there, and the barn had always had Clem's particular presence in it. The sound of him moving through the chores, the steady rhythm of a man who knew where everything was and what everything needed. The finishing pigs were fighting each other in ways that left marks. They startled at the feeder motor cycling on. They squabbled at the feeding bunk more than she remembered them squabbling. The carcass bruising on the last 2 loads she had shipped to Des Moines had been bad enough that the buyer had mentioned it when he settled up with her. He was a gentleman who had been buying from Clem for years, and he said it the way a gentleman says a difficult thing, factually, because his job required him to be accurate, and because the bruising showed up on every grading sheet whether anyone mentioned it or not. Bruised pork grades down. Graded down pork pays less. Willa had lost approximately $80 per head on those 2 loads. Because of stress bruising she did not know how to fix. On a load of 40 hogs, $80 a head was $3,200. On a farming operation with a mortgage and a widow trying to hold on for 1 more year, $3,200 was not a rounding error. It was a margin she could not afford to lose again and again and again through an entire production cycle while she figured out what to do. That was when she got out the binder. Let me tell you about Adeline Breck, because the widow who wired commercial audio equipment into her hog barn in October of 1982 did not arrive at that decision by accident or impulse or grief-softened judgment. She arrived at it through a chain of reading that had started before she was born on a dairy farm outside of Ames, Iowa, in the kitchen of a woman who had understood something important about how knowledge moves and who it moves to. Adeline Breck had been, before her marriage in 1937, a home economics instructor at Iowa State College, the institution that would later become Iowa State University, and that had been since its founding one of the primary agricultural research universities in the American Midwest. She had been a serious teacher in the way that women of her generation and training were serious teachers, methodical and precise and genuinely interested in whether her students actually learned what she was trying to give them. She had married Robert Breck in 1937 and had left teaching to run a household and eventually a dairy farm. But Adeline had not stopped reading. The college sent out extension bulletins every month, short technical papers written in plain English by researchers at the University Experiment Station, intended for farmers and their families to use on their own operations. Most farm families received these bulletins. Most of them went into a kitchen drawer or a pile on the counter and eventually got recycled or used to start the wood stove. Adeline read every one of them. She read them the way she had graded papers carefully and with a pencil in her hand. And she kept them organized in a 3-ring binder she bought at the hardware store in Ames in 1937 and replenished as needed over the following decades. The binder lived on the kitchen shelf next to the cookbooks because the kitchen shelf was where useful things lived, and Adeline considered the bulletins useful in the specific and serious way that she considered everything that helped her understand the operation she was part of. When Willa left home in 1957 to marry Clem Garnett and begin her life on the farm outside of Perry, Adeline wrapped the binder in brown paper and tied it with kitchen string and gave it to her daughter on the morning of the wedding, not as a sentimental gesture, as a practical one. She told Willa something that her own mother had not told her, and that she wished someone had told her when she was Willa's age. She said that a woman who read the bulletins had access to knowledge that the men at the cafe and the grain elevator and the co-op had not bothered to find out. She said it mattered. She said it would matter for the rest of Willa's life. She said to keep reading them. Then she handed her the binder and went back to getting ready for the ceremony. Willa had taken the binder to the Garnett farm and had added to it every month for 25 years. When Clem bought new equipment, Willa found the relevant bulletins and read them. When they began raising hogs in 1971, she read every swine bulletin the university had published since 1955. She cross-referenced. She took notes in the margins in the rounded cursive she had been using since grade school. Adeline had died in 1976, and Willa had continued the work alone the way you continue things that have become part of how you understand your life. By October of 1982, the binder had become 3 binders organized by subject and year, sitting on the kitchen shelf in the spot that Adeline's original binder had occupied since 1957. 25 years of extension bulletins on every topic that had ever mattered to a Midwestern farm family in Adeline's schoolteacher script, and Willa's rounded cursive, and a later handwriting that was a hybrid of both. Clem had joked more than once that if the house ever caught fire, Willa would save the binders before she saved the wedding photographs. Willa had always told him she would save both. She had not told him that the order depended on which way the fire was moving. In those 3 binders, between a 1971 paper on corn nitrogen uptake and a 1976 paper on alfalfa weevil identification and management, there was a short bulletin published by the Iowa State University Animal Science Department in August of 1974. It was titled Ambient Sound Exposure and Stress Response in Confinement-Raised Swine. It was 6 pages long. Willa had read it when it arrived in August of 1974 and had filed it in the appropriate section of the appropriate binder, and had not thought about it again for 8 years. Because at the time, she and Clem were raising their finishing hogs on a combination of pasture and partial confinement, and the bulletin was specifically about fully enclosed confinement operations, which was not what they were running in 1974. In October of 1982, sitting at the kitchen table with a ledger open in front of her and a number at the bottom of the column that represented $3,200, she could not afford to keep losing. Willa remembered the bulletin. She went to the binder. She found it where she had filed it 8 years earlier. The pages slightly yellowed at the edges, the staple in the upper left corner beginning to rust at the point where it met the paper. She sat down at the table and read it from the first page to the last. The bulletin described an experiment the university had conducted in 1972 and 1973 on a university-owned hog finishing operation near Ankeny. Researchers had installed commercial-grade speakers in 2 identical finishing barns. One barn received continuous low-volume audio throughout the finishing cycle. The other barn served as the control operating under the normal acoustic conditions of a confinement finishing operation, which the bulletin described with careful precision as an environment characterized by intermittent mechanical sounds of high amplitude and unpredictable onset, which translated out of academic language meant a barn full of feeder motors and ventilation fans and doors and equipment, all of which made sudden loud noises at irregular intervals throughout the day and night. The audio in the treatment barn was a specific mixture. The researchers had been precise about this. It included classical instrumental music selected for a predictable harmonic structure and the absence of sudden dynamic changes. It included human voices reading text aloud at conversational volume, and it included what the bulletin called pink noise, a steady low-frequency background sound that the researchers described as a masking signal, something that fills the acoustic environment at a low enough level to cover the sudden sounds that trigger startle responses without being loud enough to constitute a stressor in itself. The experiment ran for 18 months across 3 consecutive groups of finishing hogs. The researchers measured cortisol levels in blood samples drawn at regular intervals. They measured daily weight gain. They measured feed conversion ratios. They counted fighting injuries and documented bruising rates at slaughter through the grading records at the processing facility. The results were set out in plain language in the second half of the bulletin. and Willa read them in the same way she had read everything her mother had taught her to read slowly, with a pencil in her hand. Hogs in the audio treatment barn showed a 38% reduction in circulating cortisol compared to the control group across the full 18 months of the study. They gained weight 4.2% faster than the control animals. They had a 31% reduction in fighting-related injuries. They converted feed to body weight 3.4% more efficiently than the controls. And the number that stopped Willa mid-sentence when she reached it, they graded out at the processing plant with 23% less carcass bruising than the control group. The bulletin explained the mechanism in a section that Willa underlined twice. Hogs in confinement operations live inside an acoustic environment that is, from the evolutionary perspective of an animal whose nervous system developed over millions of years on open ground, genuinely alarming. Every sudden sound, every unexpected mechanical noise triggers a startle response. The startle response is involuntary. It is the physiological expression of a survival mechanism that kept the ancestors of domestic hogs alive by treating every unexpected sound as a potential predator until proven otherwise. The startle response releases cortisol. Repeated cortisol release across an 18 to 24-week finishing cycle causes measurable and consistent consequences. Reduced daily weight gain, increased aggression between animals, increased muscle damage from fighting, which shows up as bruising at slaughter, lower feed conversion efficiency as metabolic resources that should be going into growth are diverted into stress response. Continuous ambient audio at the right volume masked the acoustic events that triggered the startle response. Not loud enough to be a stressor itself, loud enough to fill the gaps in the acoustic environment that made each sudden sound stand out and register as a threat signal. The hogs in the treatment barn still responded to genuinely loud events, but the dozens of small acoustic events that would otherwise have been triggering low-level stress responses all day long, every day, for the full finishing cycle, simply stopped triggering them. The bulletin recommended weatherproof commercial speakers, a volume of 55 to 65 decibels measured at the center of the barn. Continuous 24-hour operation, because any extended period of silence would reset the animal's auditory threshold and eliminate the masking benefit the system depended on. The cost-benefit analysis in the final section of the bulletin was written in the careful, conservative language of academic researchers who did not want to overstate their conclusions. But even in that careful language, the numbers were clear. On a 50-sow farrow-to-finish operation, producing approximately 800 market hogs per year, the researchers estimated that the feed conversion improvement alone would return the cost of a commercial audio installation in under 90 days. Any revenue improvement from reduced bruising and improved grading premiums was a secondary benefit on top of that. Willa sat at the kitchen table and read the bulletin twice. Then she sat for a while with the binder open in front of her. She was looking at a piece of research published 8 years ago by a university 40 miles from where she was sitting, addressing a problem she had been losing money on for the past 2 months. Written in language clear enough that she had understood it completely. On the first reading and filed in the correct section of the correct binder where it had been sitting accurately organized and immediately retrievable for 8 years. Nobody in Dallas County had mentioned it to her. Not the extension agent, not the buyers from Des Moines, not any of the men who had been raising hogs in the county for decades and who she had heard in the months since Clem died offer various explanations and suggestions for the bruising problem, all of which involve management changes or feeding adjustments or different handling protocols in the loading chute. Not one of them had suggested that the problem might be acoustic. Willa drove into Des Moines on a Saturday morning in early October. She left the farm at 7 and drove the hour into the city with the bulletin in her coat pocket and the address of a commercial audio supplier she had found in the business directory at the Perry Public Library, written on a slip of paper on the passenger seat. The business was called Whitmer Commercial Audio, located on the east side of Des Moines in a commercial strip that also housed a plumbing supply and a small engine repair shop. Glenn Whitmer had been selling commercial audio equipment to schools and churches and small businesses for 11 years. He was behind the counter when Willa came in, and he asked her what the application was without any particular expectation in his voice. She said it was a hog finishing barn in Dallas County. Glenn Whitmer did not laugh. He had been in retail long enough to know that a customer who walks in with specific requirements and a piece of paper in her coat pocket usually knows more about what she needs than the person behind the counter. He asked if she had a specification document. Willa took the bulletin out of her coat pocket and laid it on the counter. Glenn Whitmer picked it up and read it. He read it the way a professional reads a technical specification, going through it systematically, pausing at the passages that were directly relevant to what he would need to assemble. He was quiet for 12 minutes. Willa stood at the counter and did not rush him. When he set the bulletin down, he told her he had never installed a system for this application. Then he told her he could see exactly what the specification was asking for, and that he could put together something that met it. He spent 20 minutes writing up a component list. 4 weatherproof horn speakers rated for agricultural and outdoor environments, a commercial-grade amplifier with automatic volume limiting, a commercial AM and FM receiver with timer functions, and a battery backup for power interruptions, armored cable rated for agricultural use, a calibrated decibel meter for installation and ongoing calibration. The total came to $612. Glenn Whitmer applied a 10% discount without being asked and told Willa he wanted to know how the experiment turned out. Willa wrote the check. She loaded the boxes into her pickup, covered them with a tarp against the October weather, and drove back to Perry. She installed the system over the following weekend with Tommy Vouse's help. Tommy was 17 years old and had been helping on the farm 3 afternoons a week since May, handling the afternoon chores that were too heavy or too time-consuming for Willa to manage alone, on top of everything else. He was a quiet boy who worked hard and did not ask unnecessary questions, which were the 2 qualities Willa valued most in a farmhand regardless of age. They ran the armored cable through the rafters of the finishing barn on Saturday morning, Tommy pulling while Willa directed from below, walking the length of the barn to check the sight lines and make sure the speaker positions would give even coverage across the entire floor area. On Saturday afternoon, they mounted the 4 speakers. On Sunday morning, Willa wired the amplifier and the receiver in the small equipment room at the south end of the barn and connected the system to the farm's electrical supply. At one point on Saturday afternoon, while they were working a particularly difficult run of cable around a structural beam near the northwest corner of the barn, Tommy asked whether she was absolutely sure about this. Willa was on the top step of the ladder when he asked it. She did not come down from the ladder. She kept working the cable around the beam and told Tommy that she was not absolutely sure about anything. She said she had read a paper from the university and the paper said this would work, and she was going to find out whether the paper was right. Tommy considered this for a moment. Then he nodded. Then he went back to pulling cable. By Sunday afternoon, the system was running. Willa tuned the receiver to KWOI-FM, the Iowa State University public radio station broadcasting from Ames, which carried classical music during the day, agricultural programming at scheduled intervals, and talk programming in the evenings. The signal reached Dallas County clearly. She set the volume using the calibrated decibel meter from Glenn Whitmer, walking the barn floor and measuring at the center of each quadrant until she had a consistent reading of 62 decibels at the center of the barn. The hogs reacted within 20 minutes. The animals closest to the speakers stopped what they were doing and turned their ears toward the ceiling, with the focused attention of an animal, encountering something it has not encountered before. Then they went back to eating. And then over the course of the next hour, Something happened in that finishing barn that Willa had not seen in 11 years of raising hogs on this property. The squabbling at the feeder slowed. The nervous pacing stopped. The hogs ate their fill and then walked away from the bunk without the jostling and marking that had been a constant feature of the barn for months. Several animals lay down on their sides against the warm concrete floor and stretched out in the sprawling, boneless posture of an animal that is genuinely at ease. The posture that Willa associated with good conditions and low stress. The posture she had been seeing less and less of in the months since Clem died. KWOI-FM played something by Brahms. The hogs did not lift their heads. Willa stood in the doorway of the finishing barn for almost an hour, with a cup of coffee that went cold in her hands. She did not take notes. She was not in the mode of a researcher observing data. She was simply standing in the doorway of a barn that her husband had built, watching something happen that she did not fully understand yet, but that she recognized in the way you recognize something important before you can say exactly what makes it important. Somewhere underneath the part of her that was thinking about cortisol levels and feed conversion ratios and the grading sheets from Hormel, something else was happening. Something she had not had room for in the months of chores and ledgers and mortgage payments and neighbors with casseroles and the specific loneliness of learning to do alone. All the things that two people had always done together. She did not name it standing in the doorway that Sunday evening. She stood until the coffee was cold, and then she went inside. The story was across Dallas County by Tuesday. Tommy Vouse had told his father on Sunday evening. His father had mentioned it at the grain elevator in Perry on Monday morning to two other hog farmers. Those men had told their wives. Their wives had told the woman who waitressed at the Main Street Cafe. By Tuesday afternoon, when Willa drove into Perry to pick up feed at the cooperative, 3 men stopped her on the sidewalk in the space of 2 blocks to ask in the careful, neutral voices of people who want information, without appearing to want it, whether it was true what they had heard about her barn. It was true. Willa confirmed it each time. Classical music, mostly. Some talk programming in the evenings. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The men did not laugh to her face. Dallas County men were not rude to widows. They waited until she was out of earshot. The laughter that followed her down the sidewalk in Perry that Tuesday afternoon was the laughter of people who have heard something they cannot fit into any category they have, and who use laughter to manage the discomfort of that situation, which is a very old and very human response to things that do not fit. By the middle of October, Willa Garnett was known throughout Dallas County as the widow playing Brahms to her pigs. Rupert Holt drove over on a Saturday morning in late October. Rupert ran a 200 sow operation 3 miles east of the Garnett farm. He had been one of Clem Garnett's closest friends for 20 years. When Clem had died in April, Rupert had taken it the way men take the death of a close friend personally, and with a grief that expressed itself through practical action rather than conversation. He had been a steady presence in the months after the funeral. He had fixed the loading chute gate when the hinge started pulling loose from the wood. He had brought Willa a list of contractors who could help with the fall work. He had checked in regularly without making the checking in feel like surveillance. He had heard about the radio system from his wife, who had heard about it at the cafe. He drove over on that Saturday morning because he was genuinely fond of Willa and genuinely worried about her, and because he believed with the certainty of a man who had been raising hogs in central Iowa for 28 years without once considering playing music to them, that what she was doing was the kind of thing that happened when a person was not thinking clearly. He stood in Willa's finishing barn for about 10 minutes. He listened to KWOI-FM, playing something he could not identify, something orchestral and unhurried moving through the speakers mounted in the rafters above him. He watched the hogs move around the barn floor in a state of calm that he registered without immediately acknowledging what he was registering. He looked at the animals lying in the open floor space away from the feeders, the sprawling, easy posture of animals with no immediate concern. Then he turned to Willa and said what he had driven over to say. He said it as a friend, and he intended it as a friend. And it was, in fact, the kind of thing a genuine friend says, which is the thing that needs to be said, regardless of how uncomfortable it is to say it. He told her that people were talking. He told her that when people started talking about a farm operation in a certain way, banks started paying attention. And she had a mortgage, and she could not afford to become a story that made people raise their eyebrows when her name came up at the agricultural lender's office in Perry. He told her he was saying this because of what Clem had built. He told her that Clem had spent 11 years building something real on this ground, and that Willa owed it to what Clem had built to be careful. He was not wrong about any of those things in any abstract sense. Willa understood this. She listened to everything Rupert said without interrupting. She thanked him for driving over. She told him she understood his concern and that she would think about it carefully. She walked him back to his truck. She waved as he pulled out of the drive. Then she turned and walked back to the finishing barn and stood in the doorway for a moment, listening to the music and watching the hogs. Then she went to the equipment room and checked the volume calibration against the decibel meter. 62 decibels at center barn, exactly where it was supposed to be. She did not change anything. Now let me ask you something before we go further. Rupert Holt had been raising hogs for 28 years. He was not a foolish man. He was not a cruel man. He was by any reasonable measure one of the more successful hog producers in central Iowa. He looked at what Willa was doing in October of 1982, and he drew the most reasonable conclusion available to him from what he could see. He was reasoning from 28 years of experience in an industry that had never in any conversation he had participated in ever mentioned playing audio to finishing hogs as a production management strategy. Willa was reasoning from 6 pages of a bulletin published by Iowa State University in August of 1974, which described a controlled experiment run across 3 consecutive finishing groups, with measured outcomes and a cost-benefit analysis that was conservative enough to hold up under scrutiny. The distance between those 2 kinds of knowing, between the knowledge that circulates at the grain elevator and the knowledge that sits in a university bulletin on a shelf in a binder that nobody else has bothered to read, was the distance between a farm operation that was quietly failing and a farm operation that was about to become something else entirely. Adeline Breck had understood that distance in 1937, when she started keeping the binder. She had understood it well enough to wrap the binder in brown paper and tie it with kitchen string and give it to her daughter on the morning of her wedding with specific instructions to keep reading. Willa had understood it well enough to keep reading for 25 years through good harvests and difficult ones, through the years when Clem was alive and running the operation, and through the months since he died when the operation was entirely hers to run or to lose. What nobody in Dallas County understood yet, standing at the fence or sitting at the cafe or driving away from the Garnett farm on County Road F31 on a Saturday morning in October, was that the binder on the kitchen shelf was not a widow's eccentricity. It was not grief expressing itself as poor judgment. It was not sentiment dressed up as management. It was a tool, and Willa Garnett was about to use it. The first measurable result came in the weight records. Willa had been keeping weekly weight records on her finishing hogs since 1971, the year she and Clem had started the operation. Clem had set up the system and Willa had maintained it because Clem's position was that the records were how you knew what was actually happening on a farm instead of what you thought was happening, and that the difference between those 2 things was where most farming decisions went wrong. He had been right about that, as he had been right about most practical things, and Willa had kept the records with the same care after he died that she had kept them when he was alive, because the hogs did not know Clem was gone. and neither did the numbers. Every 2 weeks, she weighed a sample of 12 finishing hogs, tracking the same 12 animals from the time they entered the finishing barn until they shipped using the ear tag numbers Clem had started using in 1974 as the permanent identification system for the operation. She weighed them on the portable scale in the equipment room, the same scale Clem had bought in 1973, and calibrated against a known weight at the start of every production cycle. She recorded the weights in the ledger with the date and the barn temperature and any notable observations about the condition of the animals or the feeding behavior she had seen that week. In the 6 weeks before she installed the audio system, those 12 hogs had gained an average of 1.70 pounds per day. In the 6 weeks after she installed the system, working with the same 12 animals, same scale, same protocol, same feed, same management, in every respect except the 62 decibels of KWOI-FM playing continuously in the rafters above them, those 12 hogs gained an average of 1.78 pounds per day, a 4.7% improvement. The Iowa State Bulletin had predicted 4.2%. Willa stood at the scale on the weigh day in late November when she calculated that figure and looked at it for a long moment. Then she walked back to the equipment room and checked the calibration weight, a 50-pound cast iron block that hung on a nail beside the scale. The scale read 50 pounds. She noted it in the ledger. Then she went back and weighed the 12 hogs again, one at a time, writing each weight in a separate column on a fresh page so she could compare directly to the previous entry. The numbers were the same. She wrote the result in the ledger and moved on to the afternoon chores. She did not tell anyone what the numbers said, not Tommy Vows, who was there 3 afternoons a week and who had helped her install the system, and who was at least partially curious about whether the thing was working. Not the feed supplier when he came out on Thursday. Not any of the men at the cooperative in Perry where she picked up mineral supplements on Friday morning. The men at the cooperative had mostly stopped asking about the radio system by November, having processed it into the category of things that widows in difficult situations sometimes did, and that would sort itself out one way or another without requiring much input from them. What she had was data. Not enough data to say anything definitive yet. 6 weeks was not a production cycle, but it was consistent with what the bulletin had predicted. And consistency in the early weeks of a measurement was the thing Clem had always said mattered most, because a result that tracked a prediction in the first phase of observation was a result you could begin to trust. The feed conversion numbers tracked as well. Willa was purchasing 3.4% less feed per pound of gain than she had been purchasing in the 6 weeks before the installation. On a finishing cycle that ran from 50 pounds to 260 pounds. 3.4% less feed per pound of gain meant approximately $42 per hog in reduced feed costs. Across a production run of 40 hogs, that was nearly $1,700 she was not spending. The $612 she had paid Glenn Whitmer in Des Moines had been returned by the end of November from feed savings alone. She noted this in the ledger with no particular ceremony, the same way she noted everything else, because the ledger did not require ceremony. It required accuracy. What the ledger could not yet tell her was the number that mattered most. The number at the grading plant. The number that would appear on the Hormel settlement sheet after the buyer walked her load and assigned each carcass its grade and calculated the premium or the discount against the base market price. That number was the one she had been losing on. That was the number that $3,200 a load had come from. And she would not know what that number said about the audio system until she shipped a load of hogs that had been finished entirely under the new conditions from the beginning of their finishing cycle to the end. The load that met that criterion would ship in February of 1983. In the meantime, Dallas County continued its assessment of Willa Garnett and her radio-equipped hog barn. The story had settled by November into the comfortable form that county stories always find. eventually, which is the form that requires the least revision of existing beliefs. The widow was playing music to her pigs. It was an unusual thing to do. It was probably harmless. It was certainly strange enough to be entertaining at the cafe table, and it would sort itself out when the grading sheets from Hormel came back the way grading sheets from stressed hog operations always came back, with numbers that told the true story, regardless of what was happening in the rafters. This was not said cruelly. Almost none of it was said cruelly. People in agricultural communities are not generally cruel to their neighbors in distress. They are simply operating from the knowledge they have and the knowledge they had in Dallas County in the autumn of 1982 about the relationship between audio systems and hog finishing outcomes was exactly zero, because nobody in Dallas County had read the bulletin. Rupert Holt had said his piece in October and had gone back to his operation 3 miles east and had resumed his regular check-ins with Willa, bringing her a load of square bales from his second cutting in November, when he heard she was running low, fixing the tractor hydraulic line when it failed on a Tuesday morning. And she called him because the repair required 2 people. He was a good neighbor in the ways that counted. He did not raise the subject of the radio system again after October, but he drove County Road F31 several times a week on his way to town and back. And the Garnett farm sat on County Road F31, and Rupert Holt was a man who had been watching hog operations for 28 years, and who noticed things about hog operations the way a person notices things they have been looking at for a long time. He noticed in November that the Garnett finishing barn was quieter than it had been in September. Not the music. He could hear the faint sound of the radio when he slowed down near the property, and the music was not what he was noticing. What he was noticing was the absence of the other sounds that a finishing barn full of stressed hogs makes, the sharp squealing of animals fighting at the feeder, the constant low-grade commotion of a group of animals that has not established its hierarchy and is working through the process in the way hogs work through it with their teeth and their shoulders, and the particular aggressive persistence of an animal that is simultaneously prey-wired and stubborn. He had heard those sounds from the Garnett barn in September. He was not hearing them now in November. He did not stop the truck. He did not turn into the driveway. He slowed to 15 miles an hour on County Road F31 and looked at the barn from the road for a moment and then drove on. He did not mention what he had noticed to anyone, because mentioning it would have required him to say something he was not yet prepared to say, which was that the thing Willa was doing might not be as straightforwardly misguided as he had told her it was. Have you ever been in a situation where you were the person who gave the advice, and the person who received the advice appeared to be doing better than your advice predicted? Have you ever watched someone work quietly towards something, while the world around them continued to operate from assumptions that were not keeping up with what the evidence was showing? There is a particular quality to that situation when you are the one who gave the advice. It does not feel like watching someone prove you wrong. It feels like watching something you cannot quite explain from the road and driving on without stopping, because stopping would require a conversation you are not ready to have. Rupert Holt drove past the Garnett farm on a Wednesday afternoon in early December and slowed the truck the way he had been slowing it for 6 weeks. The barn was quiet. Through the ventilation slots near the roofline, he could hear very faintly an orchestral piece from KWOI-FM carrying on the cold air. The lot between the barn and the lane was clear. Willa was somewhere on the property, either in the barn or in the farrowing house or in the house itself, doing the work that the operation required. Rupert sat on the county road for 30 seconds. Then he put the truck back in gear and drove to town. The evening before the February load shipped, Willa sat at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night. She had been awake since 4:30 that morning, which was not unusual. She was awake before 5 most mornings because the operation required it. and because the months of running the farm alone had shifted her sleep in the direction that all sustained hard work eventually shifts. Sleep earlier and lighter and less complete. A rest that was always partially listening for the next thing that needed attention. The kitchen was warm. The ledger was open on the table in front of her. The current production record, the 12 hog sample weights, and the feed conversion calculations, and the daily observations she had been keeping since October. Adeline's binders were on the shelf above the table where they had always been, in the spot that Adeline's original binder had occupied since Willa carried it to this farm in 1957. The bulletin was in the binder where it had been filed in 1974, and where she had found it in October, and where it had gone back after she finished reading it at this same table 3 months ago. Tomorrow morning, Tommy Vouse was coming at 5 to help load the trailer. The load was 42 finished hogs. They had been in the finishing barn since late September. They had spent their entire finishing cycle from 50 pounds to market weight in the acoustic environment she had set up in October. 62 decibels of continuous audio, KWOI-FM, and the steady low-frequency masking sound that the amplifier produced when the receiver was between stations. The environment the bulletin had described, and she had built. And that had been running without interruption for 16 weeks. The weight records said what they said. The feed conversion said what it said. The fighting injuries on this group were fewer than she had documented on any comparable group in the operation's history. She had walked the load that afternoon and looked at each animal, and what she had seen was consistent with what the records showed. Hogs in good condition. Good flesh moving well without the shoulder and flank scarring that stress fighting left on animals that had spent a finishing cycle in a barn full of chronic low-grade aggression. The grading sheets from Hormel would say what they said. That was the part she could not control, and the part she had been sitting with at 11 o'clock at night in the warm kitchen with the ledger open in front of her. She was not uncertain about the research. The bulletin had been accurate to within 1/10 of a percentage point on the weight gain prediction. The feed conversion had tracked the bulletin's figure precisely. There was no reason to believe the bruising reduction figure would not track as well. The mechanism was what it was. The hogs had spent 16 weeks in a masking acoustic environment. The startle responses that would otherwise have been triggering cortisol release dozens of times a day had not been triggering. The downstream consequences of chronic cortisol elevation. The aggression, the muscle damage, the bruising had not had the biochemical foundation to develop. She understood all of that. The science was not what she was sitting with at 11 o'clock. What she was sitting with was something older than science and harder to put in a ledger column. Clem had built this operation for 11 years. He had woken up before 5 every morning for 11 years and walked out to these barns and done the work that the operation required. And the operation he built was what stood between Willa and the outcome that everyone in Dallas County had privately expected since April. The mortgage on this property was a real number. The relationship between Willa Garnett and the agricultural lender in Perry was a real relationship that depended on real performance, not on the performance she believed she was capable of producing, or the performance that a 1974 bulletin had predicted, but on the performance that actually showed up on the grading sheets. If the grading sheets from Hormel came back tomorrow with numbers that looked like the grading sheets from the fall, if the system had not done what the research said it would do, if there was some variable between the university's controlled experiment near Ankeny in 1972 and her finishing barn on County Road F31 in 1983 that invalidated the comparison, then the conversation she would be having next week would not be about feed conversion ratios. It would be about the mortgage. She looked at the ledger for a long time. Then she noticed that her hands were not entirely steady when she turned the page to write the final pre-shipment observation for the load, not from cold. The kitchen was warm enough from something that lived in the space between knowing something and having the thing you know confirmed in a setting where confirmation is the only thing that matters. She had read the bulletin, and she believed the bulletin and the data she had collected for 16 weeks was consistent with the bulletin in every measurable way. She also understood that the grading sheet from Hormel was not a controlled experiment. It was not a laboratory result. It was the actual world measuring the actual output of her actual farm, and the actual world had a long history of not cooperating with the predictions of even carefully designed research. She sat at the table for a while longer. Then she got up and went out to the finishing barn to do a final check on the load before the morning. KWOI-FM was playing something slow and sustained, strings primarily the kind of orchestral piece that moves at the pace of something that has no urgency. The finishing barn was at the temperature it was supposed to be at. The animals were settled. Several of them were lying down. She walked the length of the barn, slowly looking at each animal, the way Clem had taught her to look at them, not for any specific symptom, but for the overall quality of how they were carrying themselves. The thing a person who has been around animals long enough learns to read before they can articulate what they are reading. What she saw was what she had been seeing for 16 weeks. She went back inside, checked the calibration on the decibel meter one more time out of habit rather than necessity, and went to bed. Tommy Vouse arrived at 5 the next morning. They loaded the trailer in the dark, working by the lights Clem had installed along the loading barn roofline in 1978. The load was 42 hogs moving well, loading without the kind of resistance that stressed animals show in the chute. The digging in and the fighting backward, and the piling that makes loading take twice as long and leaves marks on the animals before they ever reach the plant. The trailer driver was a man named Pete Holloway, who had been hauling hogs out of Dallas County for 15 years, and who had been loading at the Garnett farm since the early 1970s. He backed the trailer into position and watched the loading through his side mirror without getting out of the cab, which was what Pete Holloway did when a load was going smoothly. When Willa climbed into the passenger seat of Pete's cab with her ledger on her lap and a thermos of coffee at her feet, Pete raised an eyebrow. She told him she was riding along. She had never ridden along on a load before. He looked at her for a moment, and then he put the truck in gear. They drove north on the highway in the dark, and then west, the trailer steady behind them in the February cold, the flat white fields of central Iowa, moving past the windows in the pale gray light of an early February morning. Willa sat with her ledger and watched the fields go by and did not say much. Pete Holloway was not a man who required conversation, which was one of the reasons he had been hauling hogs out of Dallas County for 15 years without anyone asking him to do something different. The Hormel plant in Fort Dodge was a large operation, set back from the highway behind a receiving yard that could handle multiple trailers simultaneously. Pete backed into the assigned unloading bay. The ground crew began moving the hogs off the trailer with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this particular job thousands of times and who were very good at it. The buyer that morning was a man named Art Sessler. He had been grading hogs at the Hormel plant in Fort Dodge for 9 years. He was not the senior buyer. He was the morning shift grader, competent and thorough. And he walked Willa's load, the way he walked every load, moving through the group of animals as they came off the trailer and into the receiving area, evaluating each animal by the criteria he had been trained to evaluate, and that 9 years of doing this job had made automatic. He walked the load once. He stopped at the far end of the receiving area. He turned and looked back at the group of hogs moving through the space behind him. Then he walked the load a second time more slowly than the first time, pausing at specific animals, moving his hands along shoulders and flanks in the practiced examination of someone checking for something specific. He was checking for bruising for the subcutaneous muscle damage that chronic stress fighting leaves in the tissue under the skin. The damage that shows up in the grading and in the carcass yield. and that tells the story of what kind of finishing operation produced the animal, regardless of what the farmer says about his management. He was checking for it, and he was not finding it in the quantity he expected to find it. He went into the small office off the receiving floor. He came back out with a man named Dolph Cranmer. Dolph Cranmer had been buying hogs for Hormel in Fort Dodge for 23 years. He was the plant's senior buyer, the person whose job it was to know what a hog looked like when it came in, what the carcass would yield, what grade the animal would meet, and what that grade meant for what the farmer would be paid. He had walked more hog loads in 23 years than he could count, and he had developed the particular confidence of expertise, the ability to assess quickly and accurately, which is not arrogance, but is the genuine product of sustained experience applied consistently over a long time. He walked Willa's load. He moved through the group of animals with the economy of motion, of a man who does not need to stop and think about each step, because the steps are automatic. He paused at the third animal on the right side of the group and ran his hand along the shoulder the way Art Sessler had done, pressing with his fingers into the area behind the shoulder blade, where the deepest bruising typically concentrates. He did not find what he was looking for. He moved to the next animal, then the next. He worked through the group methodically, the way he had worked through thousands of loads over 23 years. And the result he was getting was not the result that 23 years of experience had taught him to expect from a 50-sow operation in central Iowa shipping in February. He turned and looked at Willa. She was standing near the entry to the receiving area with her ledger under her arm and her coat buttoned against the cold of the receiving floor, which was cold in the specific way that large refrigerated industrial spaces are cold. Not outdoor cold, but the steady ambient cold of a temperature maintained for a purpose. Dolph Cranmer told her he had been buying hogs in this plant for 23 years. He told her he had never seen a load from a 50-sow operation looking like this load. He told her he would like to know what she was doing up there. Willa opened her ledger. She showed him the weight records from the 16 weeks since October. She showed him the feed conversion calculations. She told him about the bulletin from Iowa State, the one from August of 1974, the 6-page paper about ambient sound exposure and stress response in confinement, raised swine. She told him about Glenn Whitmer and the $612 and the 4 weatherproof horn speakers in the rafters of the finishing barn. She told him about KWOI-FM, playing at 62 decibels 24 hours a day, 7 days a week since the 3rd weekend of October. She told him about her mother and the binder on the kitchen shelf. Dolph Cranmer listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He asked 3 questions when she finished. He asked what radio station. He asked what decibel level. He asked whether she still had the original bulletin. Willa told him yes to the 3rd question and said she had a copy she could send him. He told her he would appreciate that. Then he told her he would like to have someone from Hormel come out to her farm at some point, if she was willing to look at the operation. Willa said she was willing. Then she rode back to Perry with Pete Holloway in the empty trailer in the February cold. The thermos still between her feet, and the ledger in her lap, watching the flat white fields of central Iowa pass by the window in the mid-morning light. She did not take the grading sheets out of her coat pocket and read them while she was in the truck. She did not read them when she got home and took her coat off either. She put the kettle on. She sat down at the kitchen table. She waited until the kettle was ready and she had made a cup of tea and set it in front of her on the table. Then she took the grading sheets out of her coat pocket and laid them flat on the table in front of the tea. She read them 3 times. The load had graded out at the highest premium tier that Hormel offered, a carcass quality designation that paid an additional $14.20 per hundredweight above the base market price. On a 260-pound market hog that was approximately $37 per head, above what the same animal would have brought at standard grade. On a load of 42 hogs, it was $1,554 above what the load would have earned at the grade her loads had been earning in the fall. She had been losing $3,200 a load in the fall from bruising penalties. She was earning $1,554 above base in February from a premium that reflected what the hogs looked like when Dolph Cranmer walked them. The difference between those two numbers measured across a full year of production against a mortgage and a property that 11 men in Dallas County had privately expected to be on the market before the first anniversary of Clem Garnett's death was the difference between losing the farm and keeping it. She put her head down on her arms on the kitchen table. She cried for about 10 minutes quietly, the way a person cries when there is no one to see them, and no particular need for the crying to be anything other than what it is, which is the body releasing something that has been held too long. She did not cry about the grading sheets. She cried about April, which she had not cried about in the way it needed to be cried about, because April had been immediately followed by everything that required her attention and care, and the particular kind of competence that doesn't leave room for grief to move through in its own time. The tea was still warm when she lifted her head. She sat for a while. Then she got up and went out to the barn to check on the farrowing sows, because the farrowing house had 2 sows within a week of their due dates, and the February cold required checking more often than the calendar strictly demanded. KWOI-FM was playing a piano concerto in the finishing barn as she walked past. She could hear it faintly through the insulated walls. The sound came through the way music comes through the walls of a building when it is playing at a comfortable volume inside present, but not intrusive, a sound that is part of the building without dominating it. She did not stop at the finishing barn. She went to the farrowing house and checked the sows and came back through the cold February evening and went inside and sat at the kitchen table with the grading sheets and the ledger open in front of her and began working out the projection for the full year. Feed savings per finishing cycle, approximately $42 per hog. Premium per head above base grade, $37. Total per head advantage over pre-system performance, $79 excluding the reversal of the previous bruising penalty, which added another $80 per head recovered, against $612 in equipment cost. She wrote the numbers in the ledger in the same plain way she wrote everything in the ledger, and then she sat looking at them for a while. Somewhere in the column of numbers on that page was a different conversation than the one Dallas County had been having about Willa Garnett and her barn full of classical music. The conversation that the numbers wanted to have was about what happens when a piece of knowledge that is available to everyone, published and archived and mailed out by a university to every farm family in the state, actually gets read by someone and applied to a real operation with a real mortgage and a real problem that needed solving. It was not a complicated conversation. It was just not a conversation that had been happening. The men at the cafe and the grain elevator and the cooperative were reasoning from experience. 28 years of raising hogs, 15 years of buying loads, 11 years of watching a neighboring operation. All of it real. All of it valuable in the ways that accumulated practical experience is always valuable. None of it included 6 pages from August of 1974. Willa closed the ledger. She put the grading sheets in the manila folder where she kept the shipping records. She washed the teacup. Then she went to bed, and for the first time since April, she slept through the night. Owen Pickard drove out to the Garnett farm on a Tuesday morning in April of 1983. He arrived exactly 1 year, almost to the day after Clem Garnett had died in the loading chute on a Monday morning in April of 1982. Willa did not know this when she saw his truck turn into the drive from the kitchen window. She had not been keeping track of the anniversary in any conscious way, because keeping track of anniversaries requires a kind of attention that the operation did not leave room for, and because the date itself was not something she needed a calendar to remember. Owen Pickard was Hormel's regional producer relations manager for Central Iowa. His job was to identify the producers in his territory whose operations were producing results that stood out from the baseline, find out what those producers were doing differently, and determine whether what they were doing was something that Hormel had an interest in understanding better or encouraging more broadly. He had been doing this job for 16 years. He had visited somewhere between 300 and 400 individual hog operations in central Iowa in that time. Everything from small farrow to finish operations like the Garnet Farm to large finishing-only operations with thousands of head moving through on a continuous basis. He had received the memo from Dolph Cranmer in February, 2 days after Willa's load had come through the plant, and Dolph had walked it twice and called Art Sessler back out to the receiving floor, and then sat down that evening and written 2 pages about what he had seen and what the farmer had told him about how she was producing it. The memo had moved up 3 levels of Hormel management in less than a week, which was not the normal speed at which memos move through a meat processing company's organizational structure. It had reached Owen Pickard with a note attached from his supervisor, asking him to go look at the operation personally and report back. Owen had called Willa in March to schedule the visit. She had been direct with him on the phone, which he appreciated because farmers who were doing something genuinely different were usually either very open about it or very closed about it. And the ones who were open about it were almost always the ones who had something real to show. She told him to come on a Tuesday and she would have the operation ready for him to walk through. He parked in the drive beside the equipment shed. Willa met him at the door of the farmhouse in a clean work shirt and her good jeans, which was how she dressed when she was receiving someone from a company, rather than doing morning chores. She gave him coffee. She walked him through the farrowing house first, then the nursery, then the finishing barn, moving through each space in the order that the production cycle followed, beginning to end the way the hogs themselves moved through the operation from birth to market. In the finishing barn, Owen stood in the center of the floor and looked up at the 4 weatherproof horn speakers mounted in the rafters. KWOI-FM was playing something he recognized but could not name a string quartet, unhurried moving through the warm air of the barn, above the sound of the feeder motors and the ventilation system. The hogs in the pens along the east wall were doing what the hogs in that barn had been doing since October, which was eating, resting, and conducting the normal, low-level social activity of a finishing group, without the chronic agitation that stress produces. He stood in the center of the floor for a while without saying anything. Then Willa walked him back to the farmhouse and sat him down at the kitchen table. She opened the ledger first. She showed him the 12 hog sample weights recorded every 2 weeks from October through February, the progression of entries in her rounded cursive, showing the consistent 1.78 pounds per day average that had held across the entire period since installation. She showed him the feed conversion calculations, the column of figures that documented 3.4% less feed per pound of gain across 16 weeks of production. She showed him every grading sheet from every load she had shipped since October, the progression of results from the fall loads with their bruising penalties to the February load that had graded at Hormel's highest premium tier. Then she opened Adeline's binder and took out the bulletin. She laid it on the table in front of Owen Pickard and told him it was 6 pages published by Iowa State University in August of 1974. She told him about the controlled experiment near Ankeny, the 2 identical barns, the 3 consecutive finishing groups, the 18 months of measurement. She read him the key figures from the results section: the 38% cortisol reduction, the 4.2% weight gain improvement, the 23% bruising reduction, the 90-day payback period from feed savings alone. Then she told him about her mother, She told him about Adeline Breck and the binder that had lived on the kitchen shelf since 1957, the 30 years of extension bulletins organized by subject and year, the system that Adeline had built from a home economics teacher's instinct that information needed to be kept in order to be useful, and that information kept in order was more valuable than information that existed but could not be found. She told him about the morning of her wedding when Adeline had wrapped the binder in brown paper and tied it with kitchen string, and what Adeline had told her when she handed it over. Owen Pickard listened to all of it without interrupting. He was a good listener in the way that people who have spent 16 years gathering information from farmers learn to be good listeners, attentive and patient and genuinely curious. Understanding that the farmer in front of him always knew something about the specific operation that he did not know, and that his job was to understand that specific thing as accurately as possible. When Willa finished, he sat quietly for a moment. Then he told her he had been at Hormel for 16 years. He told her he had visited somewhere between 300 and 400 producer operations in central Iowa in that time. He told her he had never seen anything like what she had on the kitchen table. He meant the combination of things, not just the ledger, though. The ledger was unusually detailed. Not just the grading sheets, though. The progression from fall to February was striking in the way that clean data is always striking when it tells a clear story. What he meant was the whole of it, the bulletin that had been published 9 years ago, and that nobody in Dallas County had read until a widow needed to solve a problem and went looking through her mother's binder. The systematic application of that bulletin to a working operation with a real mortgage and real consequences, and the records that documented the result in the same plain, careful way that the operation had been run since Clem Garnett set up the record system in 1971. He asked her whether she would be willing to let Hormel use her operation as a case study. Willa told him she would think about it. She called him back 2 weeks later on a Thursday morning in late April. She told him yes with one condition. The condition was that the case study had to present what she had done accurately, which meant it had to be a story about what happens when a farmer reads the university research and applies it to a working operation. The bulletin had existed since 1974. The research was Iowa State's, not hers. The experiment had been run by university scientists in 1972 and 1973, and they had published every number. She had read the bulletin and installed the system and kept the records, but the knowledge that made the system work was in the bulletin, and the bulletin had been available to every hog farmer in Iowa for 9 years. She was not the person who had discovered anything. She was the first person in Dallas County who had bothered to look for what was already there. Owen Pickard agreed to the condition without hesitation. He told her it was exactly the story Hormel wanted to tell. In June of 1983, a chartered bus left the Hormel plant in Fort Dodge at 7:30 in the morning carrying 12 hog producers from across central Iowa. Hormel had organized the tour through their producer relations network, reaching out through the county agricultural offices and the cooperative extension contacts to identify operations that were in the size range and production type where what the Garnett farm had done would be directly applicable. The 12 producers on the bus ran operations ranging from 40 sows to 350 sows. Every one of them was a farrow-to-finish operation. Every one of them had seen the bruising numbers on their own grading sheets often enough that the problem was familiar. Owen Pickard was on the bus. He had brought along a swine nutritionist from Iowa State University who had been familiar with the 1974 bulletin and who could speak to the research behind the audio system from the scientific side. The county extension agent for Dallas County was there as well, a man who had been somewhat embarrassed when Owen called to invite him, having spent several months in the vague general vicinity of the Garnett operation, without once suggesting to Willa that the 1974 bulletin might address her bruising problem, despite the fact that the bulletin was part of the extension archive he was theoretically responsible for. Rupert Holt was one of the 12 producers. He had been contacted directly by Owen Pickard, who had identified him through the county extension records as the largest farrow-to-finish operator in Dallas County, and as a man with a long history with the Garnett operation. Rupert had accepted the invitation without asking too many questions, which was not his usual approach to invitations from processing company representatives, but which seemed appropriate in this case for reasons he did not fully articulate to himself. He had ridden a bus for 2 hours to attend a farm tour at a 50-sow operation 7 miles from his own property on a road he had driven hundreds of times. He was aware of the specific quality of this situation. He was not a man who was unaware of the specific quality of situations. The bus pulled into the Garnett Drive at 9:30. Willa had coffee and pastries from the bakery in Perry set out on a folding table in the farmyard. She was wearing the same clean work shirt and good jeans she had worn for Owen Pickard's visit in April. She greeted the group at the bus door and walked them through the operation in the same order. She had walked Owen through it. Farrowing house nursery, finishing barn, the production sequence from beginning to end. In the finishing barn, 12 hog producers stood in the center of the floor and looked up at 4 weatherproof horn speakers in the rafters of a 50-sow operation, while KWOI-FM played something none of them could identify. The same thing Owen Pickard had done in April. The same involuntary upward look that every person who enters that barn makes when they hear music coming from above a group of finishing hogs. The Iowa State nutritionist spoke for about 20 minutes, walking the group through the mechanism in the bulletin, the acoustic stress response, the cortisol cascade, the downstream consequences for weight gain and feed conversion and bruising at slaughter. He had a clipboard with the key figures from the 1974 research, and he read them out in the plain language that extension educators use when they are translating research for a working farmer audience. Then Owen Pickard talked about the grading sheets. He showed them the comparison between Willa's fall loads and the February load, the numbers set side by side in a 1-page summary that one of the Hormel administrative staff had prepared from the plant records. He showed them the premium calculation. He showed them what a year of production at the February grade level was worth to a 50-sow operation against a year of production at the full grade level. Willa stood near the door of the finishing barn while Owen talked. She did not speak unless someone directed a question specifically to her, and even then she answered directly and briefly, and returned the floor to Owen or to the Iowa State nutritionist, because she had made her own assessment of what her role in this morning was. And her role was not to give a presentation. She had kept the records, and she had shipped the loads, and she had let the grading sheets say what they said. That was her contribution. The rest of it was other people's work. When the presentation was finished and the group had moved back out to the farmyard and were standing around the coffee table with cups in their hands, talking in the way that farmers talk after they have received information, they are in the process of deciding what to do with. Rupert Holt separated from the group and walked toward Willa. He was holding his cap in both hands when he reached her. He had taken it off at some point in the finishing barn and had not put it back on, which was not something Rupert Holt typically did on a farm visit, because a man who has been farming in central Iowa for 28 years treats his cap as a working part of his equipment and does not go around without it. Several of the other producers watched without quite meaning to watch the way a group of people who have been in the same room for an hour notices when 2 of the people in the room have something between them that the rest of the room does not fully understand. Rupert told Willa he owed her an apology. He told her he had come to her barn in October and had told her she was going to lose the farm. He told her he had set it in front of her barn in the building that Clem had built on the operation that Clem had built, and that he had set it with the certainty of a man who believed he was telling the truth, because he was telling the truth as he understood it. which was the specific kind of wrong that was hardest to acknowledge, because it was not careless wrong or dishonest wrong, but wrong that came from believing you knew more than you did. He told her he was wrong in a bigger way than he had known how to be wrong in October. He told her he was saying it now in front of these men, because if he did not say it in front of people, it would not cost him enough to mean what it needed to mean. Willa looked at Rupert Holt the way she looked at most things, directly and without hurry. She told him there was nothing to apologize for. She told him he had come as a friend and had said what he believed to be true, which was what friends did, and that Clem would have said exactly what Rupert had said if the situation had been reversed. And it had been Rupert's wife running a hog operation with a radio system in the finishing barn. She told him Rupert had just not known about the bulletin. Rupert nodded once. He put his cap back on. He turned and walked back to the group of producers. And he did not need to say anything else, because what needed to be said had been said. Within 3 months of the June tour, Rupert Holt had installed an ambient audio system in his 200 sow finishing barn. The system was larger than Willa's, requiring 8 speakers rather than 4 to achieve consistent coverage across the greater floor area. And the commercial amplifier was a more powerful unit than the one Glenn Whitmer had assembled in October. Rupert called Glenn Whitmer directly, having gotten the name from Willa. And Glenn drove out to the Holt operation with the 1974 bulletin and his specification notes from the Garnett installation, and put together a system in 2 visits. 7 of the other 11 producers on the June tour installed systems within the following 6 months. The 8th called Willa in the fall to ask additional questions and installed a system the following spring. By 1985, approximately 40 hog finishing operations in central Iowa were running ambient audio systems. The number grew through 1986 and 1987 as the practice moved through the regional producer networks, the way effective practices always move through the grading sheets and the settlement numbers and the conversations at the grain elevator that happen when one farmer's numbers are consistently better than everyone else's, and people start asking why. In 1988, the Iowa State University Extension Service incorporated ambient audio management into its official recommendations for confinement hog finishing operations. The recommendation was based on the original 1974 research, which had been available for 14 years before anyone in the commercial production network had implemented it at scale, and on the operational data that had been accumulating since 1982. From the growing number of operations that had followed what Willa had done. The researchers who had published the 1974 bulletin began receiving inquiries from producers across the Midwest, asking whether copies of the paper were still available. The paper had been available continuously since 1974. Nobody had been asking for it. The requests arrived in a surge in 1986 and 1987. 14 years after the paper was published, driven by the spread of operational results through the producer networks of central Iowa, outward into the broader Midwestern hog finishing community. Willa expanded the Garnett operation from 50 sows to 120 sows in 1987. The expansion required a new finishing barn, which she built with a contractor from Perry, who had built 2 other finishing barns in the county, and who accepted her specification that the building be pre-wired for audio before the insulation went in, because running armored cable through a finished barn was harder than running it before the walls were closed. The new barn came online with its audio system already installed and calibrated, and the first group of finishing hogs that entered it had never known a finishing barn that was not running 62 decibels of continuous audio in the rafters. She paid off the mortgage on the Garnett farm in 1991. She drove to the Farmers Savings Bank in Perry on a Wednesday morning in October and wrote the final check at the counter with the loan officer she had been working with since the difficult months after Clem died. The man who had been patient with her in the specific and professional way that a good agricultural lender is patient with a borrower who is producing results and making her payments and asking for nothing beyond what the original agreement required. She drove home on County Road F31 and went into the kitchen and opened the small drawer where she kept the important documents, the insurance papers and the property tax records, and the deed. She took out the mortgage document, the original loan agreement from 1971 that she and Clem had signed at this same bank on the day they closed on the property. She had been a widow for 5 years at that point, and the document was 12 years old, and Clem's signature on the bottom line was the handwriting of a man she had known for 33 years. She hung the paid mortgage certificate on the wall above the kitchen table, next to the wedding photograph of herself and Clem from 1957, the one taken outside the Lutheran church in Perry on a June afternoon when she was 18 years old, and Clem was 22, and neither of them had any idea what they were going to build together over the next 25 years, or what it would cost to build it, or what it would take to keep it, after only one of them was left to do the keeping. She bought an additional 80 acres from a retiring neighbor in 1994 ground that adjoined the east side of the Garnett property, and that Clem had talked about buying for years before the price and the timing were never quite right. She added a second farrowing house in 1996 and a third finishing barn in 1998. The third barn wired for audio from the foundation, up the same way the 1987 barn had been. She retired from active hog production in 2008. She was 69 years old. She had been running the Garnett operation for 26 years, 11 of them with Clem and 15 of them alone. And the operation she handed over to the younger family from Jefferson, Iowa, who had been working with her since 2003 on a gradual transition, was not the operation that the men at the fence in October of 1982 had expected to see on the market within the year. It was a 120-sow farrow-to-finish operation, running 3 finishing barns on 260 acres, with a grading premium history at Hormel that went back 25 years, and that Owen Pickard had once described in a note he sent Willa after a retirement dinner. Hormel hosted for him in 2001 as the single most instructive producer relationship of his career. She kept the farmhouse. She kept the kitchen table where the ledger had been open on so many evenings. She kept the shelf above the table where the binders had lived since 1957. The binders were the same binders refilled and reorganized and expanded across 50 years of use. The spines worn where hands had pulled them from the shelf and replaced them. The cover of the original binder from 1937, lost somewhere in the decades of use, and replaced twice the interior organized in a system that Adeline had designed, and that Willa had maintained with the same fidelity she had maintained everything Adeline had taught her to do. The 1974 bulletin was in the second binder in its original position, in the subject section, where it had been filed in August of 1974, and where it had sat for 8 years, before Willa found it in October of 1982, and took it out and laid it on the kitchen table and read it twice. She had returned it to the binder after the visit from Owen Pickard in April of 1983, and it had been in the binder since then, the staple rust brown at its edges, the pages the color of old newspaper, a 6-page document that had spent 8 years waiting for the right person to need it badly enough to go looking. The family from Jefferson, Iowa, who took over the operation in 2008, included a daughter named Nora, who had graduated from Iowa State University's agricultural program the previous spring, and who had been working on the Garnett operation for the final year of the transition, learning the specific rhythms of this specific operation, in the way that people learn operations that have been run carefully for a long time, by being present for enough of the daily decisions to understand why things are done the way they are done, rather than simply how they are done. On the morning that Nora graduated from Iowa State before the ceremony, Willa had driven to Ames and had taken the second binder off the kitchen shelf and put it in the passenger seat of her truck and driven the 40 miles to the university. She gave the binder to Nora in the parking lot outside the Agricultural Sciences building. The original second binder from Adeline's system, rebuilt and refilled. But the same binder in all the ways that mattered, containing 50 years of extension bulletins in Adeline's schoolteacher script, and Willa's rounded cursive, and the careful printing of the decade when Willa had let the Jefferson family's daughter add the new bulletins as they arrived so she could learn the system before she owned it. She told Nora what Adeline had told her in 1957. The same words in the same order, because the words were right and had not needed improving in the 51 years since Adeline said them the first time. She told Nora that a woman who read the bulletins had access to knowledge that the men at the cafe and the grain elevator and the co-op had not bothered to find out. She told her it mattered. She told her it would matter for the rest of her life. She told her to keep reading them. Then she handed Nora the binder and went to find a seat for the ceremony. The audio system has run in the Garnett finishing barns every day since the third weekend of October 1982. The radio plays classical music and agricultural programming and talk shows and whatever else. KWOI-FM decides to broadcast into the rafters of those barns 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the same as it has been playing since Willa Garnett stood on the top step of a ladder in October of 1982 with a bolt in her teeth and a weatherproof speaker in her hands, and told Tommy Vouse that she was not absolutely sure about anything. But she had read a paper, and the paper said this would work. Rupert Holt died in the spring of 2003 at the age of 77. His hog operation had been running an audio system for 20 years by then, and the last conversation he and Willa had about it at a county agricultural meeting in the winter before he died was about whether the newer digital audio systems offered any advantage over the commercial AM and FM receivers that Willa had been using since 1982. Rupert said he had tried a digital system in the third barn and had not found it made a measurable difference. Willa said she had not changed her setup since 1987 and did not intend to. At Rupert's funeral, his wife Marjorie told Willa that Rupert had said more than once in the last years of his life that the best thing that had ever happened to his hog operation was the October morning he drove over to the Garnett farm and said the wrong thing to the right woman. Adeline Breck's binder is still in the Garnett farmhouse in Dallas County, Iowa. The kitchen shelf that has held it since 1957 holds it still. The 1974 bulletin is in the second binder where it has always been. The staple is the color of old iron. The pages are the color of paper that has been stored for 50 years in a system designed by a woman who understood that knowledge is only useful if it can be found when it is needed. Willa takes the bulletin out sometimes to show it to visitors, the agricultural journalists, and the university researchers, and the occasional Hormel representative who drives out to the farm on County Road F31 to look at the operation that started something in central Iowa in the autumn of 1982. She sets it on the kitchen table and lets them read it. It takes about 12 minutes if you read carefully, which is the same amount of time it took Glenn Whitmer in Des Moines in October of 1982. The bulletin is 6 pages long. It recommends 55 to 65 decibels. It was published in August of 1974 and has been available in the Iowa State University Extension Archive ever since, available to every hog farmer in Iowa who was on the extension mailing list, which was most of them sitting in drawers and on counters and in the occasional binder on the occasional kitchen shelf, waiting for the person who needed it badly enough to go looking. What Willa Garnett did was not complicated. She had a problem, and she went looking for the solution in the place her mother had taught her to look for solutions. And she found it in the place her mother had taught her to keep things so they could be found. She spent $612 on the solution. She kept records the way Clem had taught her to keep records. She shipped her loads and waited for the grading sheets to say what they said. She never raised her voice in Dallas County. She never argued with anyone about the radio system or the bulletin or the cortisol mechanism or the acoustic masking properties of pink noise. She let the grading sheets make the argument because she understood that no conversation at a fence line or a cafe table was going to move the men who needed to be moved, but a $14.20 per hundredweight premium on a load of 42 hogs would move anyone who was paying attention to their own settlement numbers. The knowledge that changes an operation is almost never the knowledge at the coffee table. It is almost never the knowledge that circulates through the grain elevator or the cooperative or the conversations that happen between men who have been doing the same thing, the same way for 20 years, and who are sharing what they know with each other, which is real and valuable and insufficient, because they are sharing only what they already have. The knowledge that changes things sits on a shelf in a binder that someone organized carefully, and someone else maintained for 50 years, and a third person found in a moment of genuine need, and read twice with a pencil in her hand. It has been sitting there since 1974. It will sit there until someone needs it badly enough to go looking. The hogs did not care who found it. They slept on their sides on the warm concrete floor, with the music playing in the rafters, and they converted their feed to body weight at 4.7% above the rate of every operation in Dallas County that was not running 62 decibels of continuous audio. And when they shipped to Fort Dodge, the grading sheets said what they said. That was the argument. Willa Garnett never needed another one.